crisis between Venezuela and the United States has hit its worst moment, and the worst might be just around the corner. American military ships are being attacked by paramilitary groups. The Pentagon has just labeled these incidents as hostile aggression, and Washington's response was crystal clear. Naval commanders now have authorization to use lethal force against any new provocation. This marks a radical shift in U.S. military policy, and what we've uncovered about the organization behind these attacks is going to blow your mind. Today you'll understand how a cartel that supposedly no longer exists has become America's #1 nightmare. In the last few days, President Donald Trump announced something nobody expected to see: a video of an American military strike against a Venezuelan vessel in the southern Caribbean. The footage shows the exact moment when U.S. missiles completely destroy the boat, instantly killing 11 people identified as members of the Tren de Aragua cartel. 2 days later, as a direct response to the American naval presence in the region, 2 Venezuelan F-16 fighters pulled off what the Pentagon called highly provocative. They flew low right over the destroyer USS Jason Dunham in international waters. These events aren't isolated. They represent the most significant escalation between the U.S. and Venezuela in decades. An escalation that started in Venezuelan prisons and made its way to American streets loaded with fentanyl and death. To understand why this matters to every American city, we need to dive into the dark history of Latin America's most dangerous cartel. The story of the Tren de Aragua starts in an unlikely place, inside the walls of Tocaron Penitentiary, in Venezuela's Aragua state. What began as a prison gang turned into the most feared transnational criminal organization in the Americas. Hector Guerrero Flores, known as Niño Guerrero, founded the group in the early 2010s, taking advantage of the chaos in Venezuela's prison system. While the country plunged into economic and political crisis, the Tren de Aragua grew. Tocaron prison literally became a city within prison walls, with swimming pools, a private zoo, restaurants, and even a bank. Prisoners not only controlled the jail, they started expanding their operations outside of it. The cartel developed a unique structure, unlike traditional Mexican cartels. The Tren de Aragua operates like a decentralized federation. Its tentacles spread across 16 countries in the Americas, from Mexico down to Chile, taking advantage of Venezuelan migration flows to set up cells in each country. They don't just traffic drugs, they run extortion networks, human trafficking, forced prostitution, and kidnappings. In 2023, the Venezuelan government claimed it had completely eliminated the Tren de Aragua. Nicolas Maduro showed images of Tocaron being retaken and declared that the organization had been dismantled forever. But the United States tells a very different story. According to American intelligence, the Tren de Aragua not only survived, it adapted and expanded, becoming even more dangerous because now it operates completely underground. The evolution of the Tren de Aragua into maritime operations marks a fundamental shift in the nature of modern organized crime. They didn't need to build their own fleet. They simply corrupted and infiltrated networks that were already there. Venezuelan, Colombian, and Caribbean fishermen became the cartel's hands and feet at sea. The strategy is sophisticated. The cartel uses vessels that look perfectly legit, fishing boats, commercial launches, even luxury yachts, to move shipments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They built routes that exploit the territorial waters of countries with little maritime patrol capability, creating almost invisible corridors between South America and the United States. What makes the Tren de Aragua particularly dangerous at sea is their willingness to use violence. Unlike traditional smugglers, who avoid confrontation, the Tren de Aragua treats its maritime operations as territory to be defended. U.S. authorities have documented cartel boats attacking rival vessels, threatening fishermen who refuse to cooperate, and even harassing coastal patrol boats. The vessel attacked on September 2nd was reportedly carrying a massive drug shipment bound for American streets. The strike wasn't just an anti-drug operation. It was a clear message that the United States is willing to use military force against anyone who treats the Caribbean like a free-for-all for organized crime. What happened in the days after the U.S. strike turned a counter-narcotics operation into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. On September 4th, 2 Venezuelan Air Force F-16s deliberately flew over the American destroyer USS Jason Dunham, a maneuver the Pentagon described as a show of force and highly provocative. The USS Jason Dunham is no ordinary ship. It's an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, one of the most advanced naval platforms in the world. Equipped with Aegis radar systems capable of tracking dozens of targets simultaneously and missiles that can take down aircraft hundreds of miles away. The fact that Venezuelan fighters came that close to this vessel represents an unprecedented military escalation in the region. The American response was immediate and tough. President Trump authorized U.S. naval commanders to shoot down any Venezuelan aircraft that poses a direct threat to American ships. This authorization means every future encounter between Venezuelan aircraft and U.S. warships could turn into a major international incident. Ironically, those Venezuelan F-16s were supplied by the United States decades ago, back when relations between the two countries were completely different. Now, those same American planes are being used by Maduro's government to intimidate the U.S. Navy, creating a level of tension the Caribbean hasn't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. But to grasp why the U.S. is willing to risk a military showdown with Venezuela, you have to understand what's at stake on American streets. Every boat leaving Venezuelan waters loaded with drugs can carry enough material to kill thousands of Americans. Fentanyl has completely changed the game in drug trafficking. A quantity small enough to fit in your hand can kill hundreds of people. Cartels figured out they can maximize profits by moving relatively small amounts of chemical precursors, which are then processed in clandestine labs already inside the United States. The Tren de Aragua has specialized in exactly this kind of operation, transporting precursors and highly potent synthetic drugs. The typical route works like this. Chemical precursors come mainly from China, get processed in labs in Venezuela, Colombia, and Mexico, then shipped by sea to entry points in the United States, especially Florida, Texas, and California. Once inside the country, these substances are diluted and mixed into millions of doses that flood communities from coast to coast. What makes the Tren de Aragua especially lethal is its complete lack of quality control. While traditional Mexican cartels have an interest in keeping their clients alive, the Tren de Aragua operates with a mindset of maximum immediate profit, pumping out super-potent drugs that often cause fatal overdoses. For them, each death is just a statistic in a business that rakes in billions annually. In 2024, the U.S. recorded about 391 overdose deaths, a 26.9% drop compared to the estimated 110,037 deaths in 2023. While that drop is significant, it still means more than 220 Americans dying every single day from overdoses. The reduction doesn't mean the problem is solved. It means the strategies are working. But the threat is still massive. Deaths involving synthetic opioids like fentanyl still accounted for 776 deaths in 2023, proving these substances remain the leading cause of overdose deaths in the country. What those numbers don't show is the human suffering behind every statistic. Every overdose death leaves behind a devastated family, a mourning community, and huge social and economic costs. Hospitals in areas with high fentanyl use run in a constant state of emergency. Paramedics carry multiple doses of naloxone, the antidote that can reverse opioid overdoses. Because one shot often isn't enough to save fentanyl victims, the impact goes far beyond direct deaths. Entire communities are transformed by the presence of these drugs. Crimes linked to trafficking, robberies, murders, extortions skyrocket in areas where cartels like the Tren de Aragua set up distribution hubs. Families are forced to move. Businesses shut down. Schools implement extreme safety measures. The Tren de Aragua doesn't limit itself to drug trafficking. Its spread across the United States has brought with it a type of urban violence that many American cities weren't prepared to deal with. The cartel operates with a level of brutality that shocks even authorities used to traditional organized crime. In cities like Aurora, Colorado, Denver, New York, and Miami, officials have documented Tren de Aragua activity that includes kidnappings, extortion of Latino business owners, control of prostitution rings, and forced recruitment of young immigrants. The cartel has exploited Venezuelan migration waves to infiltrate Latino communities in the U.S., using cultural and linguistic ties to build criminal networks. The strategy is insidious. Cartel members pose as ordinary immigrants looking for work and opportunities. Once they're settled in a community, they start identifying vulnerable targets, other undocumented immigrants, small business owners, families who can't go to the authorities for fear of deportation. These communities become controlled territories where the Tren de Aragua collects taxes, recruits members, and sets up drug distribution points. This phenomenon has created a complex dilemma for U.S. authorities: how to fight the cartel without criminalizing entire communities of Venezuelan immigrants, who are, for the most part, victims fleeing the same violence the Tren de Aragua represents. The question haunting U.S. naval officials is simple but terrifying. Could cartels like the Tren de Aragua actually be willing to attack U.S. ships directly? International precedents suggest yes. In the Red Sea, Houthi militias prove that non-state groups can disrupt global trade routes with drones, missiles, and fast boats. In Somalia, pirates turned international waters into high-risk zones, forcing shipping companies to hire armed security and pay sky-high insurance premiums. The Caribbean has all the right conditions to become the next stage for modern piracy. The Tren de Aragua has already shown both the capacity and the willingness to use violence against authorities. U.S. intelligence documents reveal the cartel as fast boats, automatic weapons, and, more worrying, detailed knowledge of naval patrol routes and schedules. They don't need to win a naval battle, just create enough chaos to drive up costs and force reroutes. The escalation seen in the last few days suggests we're entering a new phase of confrontation. Cartels don't operate in a vacuum. They respond to pressure with more violence. U.S. officials fear the Tren de Aragua could interpret military operations as a declaration of direct confrontation, pushing them to escalate their own tactics. The clash between the U.S. and Venezuela goes beyond a simple anti-drug operation. It represents a fundamental shift in U.S. policy toward Latin America, with Washington signaling it's ready to use military force against non-state actors that threaten American interests. Venezuela's position is clear. Nicolas Maduro denies any connection to the Tren de Aragua and calls U.S. operations imperialist aggression. The Venezuelan government insists it dismantled the cartel in 2023 and calls its existence a fiction created by international media. That narrative directly contradicts U.S. intelligence, creating an unprecedented diplomatic standoff. The legal issue is messy. U.S. military strikes in international waters against vessels from another country raise serious questions about international maritime law. Experts argue that using military force against cartels designated as foreign terrorist organizations is legally questionable, especially without cooperation from the country of origin. The regional implications are even more worrying. Other Caribbean nations fear their waters could become battle zones between American forces and Venezuelan cartels. The militarization of the drug war could turn the Caribbean into a permanent battlefield, with devastating economic consequences for a region that relies heavily on tourism and maritime trade. But to understand what could happen in the Caribbean, it's key to look at other theaters where non-state groups challenge naval powers. The Houthis in the Red Sea prove that relatively small organizations can cause global economic shocks, forcing shipping companies to avoid one of the world's most important trade routes. The parallel is scary. If the Tren de Aragua can make parts of the Caribbean unsafe for commercial shipping, the economic costs would be massive. About 6% of global maritime trade passes through the Caribbean, including a big chunk of U.S. imports. Consistent attacks on commercial ships could force route changes that drive up freight costs and, in turn, prices of basic goods in the United States. The international response to the Houthis offers a possible model. International naval coalitions patrolling sensitive waters, armed escorts for commercial ships, and coordinated military actions against operational bases. But the Caribbean brings unique challenges, unlike the Red Sea, where the Houthis operate from controlled territory. The Tren de Aragua is decentralized and mobile, making conventional military responses less effective. What makes the Tren de Aragua especially dangerous is its ability to adapt technologically. Like other modern cartels, they've incorporated drones, encrypted communication systems, and even artificial intelligence to optimize operations. Drones can be used to monitor naval patrols, identify alternate routes, and, in the worst-case scenario, for direct attacks. The technological evolution also includes increasingly sophisticated smuggling methods. U.S. authorities have found cartel boats with nearly undetectable secret compartments, GPS systems that can be shut off remotely, and even mechanisms to quickly sink cargo in case of interception. These technologies turn every naval operation into a complex high-tech cat-and-mouse game. Even more concerning is their use of open-source intelligence. The Tren de Aragua monitors social media, news sites, and even maritime tracking apps to spot naval patrol patterns. They know when and where U.S. ships will be operating, allowing them to plan routes that minimize chances of interception. The crisis in the Caribbean doesn't have simple solutions, but there are strategies that could significantly reduce the Tren de Aragua's impact. Colombia's experience fighting the FARC and traditional cartels offers valuable lessons. Long-term success requires a mix of military action, social reform, and international cooperation. The first element is shared intelligence. Caribbean nations often lack the tech capacity to monitor their own territorial waters. An integrated maritime surveillance system, funded and run cooperatively, could create a detection network that would make Tren de Aragua operations exponentially harder. Second, coordinated financial action. Cartels depend on banking systems to launder money and move profits. Targeted sanctions, asset freezes, and international banking cooperation can cut off the Tren de Aragua's financial lifelines. Without the ability to cash in, cartels lose operational capacity fast. Third, social programs in origin communities. Most Tren de Aragua members are young Venezuelans without legitimate economic opportunities. Development, education, and employment programs in Venezuela and neighboring countries can shrink the cartel's recruitment pool, attacking the problem at its root. What we've seen in the Caribbean over the last few days isn't just another chapter in the war on drugs. It's a turning point that could define hemispheric security for decades. The U.S. strike on the Tren de Aragua vessel and Venezuela's response with military flyovers set a dangerous precedent. For the first time, a Latin American cartel has become the target of U.S. military operations, and a regional government answered with a show of military force. American streets will remain the ultimate battlefield of this war. Every dose of fentanyl intercepted in the Caribbean represents lives saved in Detroit, Los Angeles, or Miami. But the price of those interceptions could be the permanent militarization of waters that were peaceful for centuries. The future of the Caribbean and the safety of millions of Americans depends on how leaders in Washington, Caracas, and Caribbean capitals decide to handle this escalation. History shows that when cartels and governments go head-to-head, it's always civilians who pay the highest price. The hope is that wisdom will outweigh provocation, and that diplomatic solutions are found before the Caribbean becomes yet another sea of permanent conflict. This is a developing story, and its consequences will be felt for generations. Stay tuned, because what happens in the rough waters of the Caribbean today will decide the safety of American streets tomorrow.